In 43 seconds, 80,000 people will be dead. They don't know it yet. Right now, at this very moment, a mother is braiding her daughter's hair for school. A man is laughing with his coworker about last night's dinner. A child is chasing a butterfly through a garden. In 43 seconds, none of them will exist. A bomb is falling through the sky above them. It weighs 10,000 pounds. Inside it, 140 pounds of uranium are about to do something that has never happened before in human history. Not in nature, not in war, not anywhere on Earth. The temperature will reach 4 million degrees. That's hotter than the center of the sun. The flash will be visible for 250 miles. People will be vaporized so completely that only their shadows will remain, burned into the stone. This is not science fiction. This is August 6th, 1945. This is Hiroshima. And you need to understand how we got here, because those weapons still exist. Thousands of them, right now. To understand the most destructive moment in human history, we must go back to the early years of World War II, when the greatest scientific minds of a generation came together to unlock the power of the atom. In 1939, physicist Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The message was urgent. German scientists were working to split the atom, and if they succeeded in creating a weapon of unimaginable power, the consequences for the free world would be catastrophic. Roosevelt took the warning seriously. By 1942, the United States had launched the Manhattan Project, a massive, top-secret program to develop an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could. The project would eventually employ over 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion, an astronomical sum for the time. The scientific director was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant theoretical physicist who assembled the greatest collection of scientific talent ever brought together for a single purpose. At secret facilities in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, scientists and engineers raced against time. The challenge was enormous. They needed to produce enough fissionable material, either uranium-235 or plutonium-239, and design a weapon that could trigger a sustained nuclear chain reaction. For 3 years, they worked around the clock, knowing that failure could mean losing the war. On July 16, 1945, in the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the Manhattan Project reached its culmination. The first atomic bomb was placed atop a 100-foot tower and detonated at 5:29 a.m. Witnesses described a light brighter than 1,000 suns. The explosion created a mushroom cloud that rose 40,000 feet into the atmosphere. The heat was so intense, it turned the desert sand into glass. The shockwave was felt over 100 miles away. J. Robert Oppenheimer later recalled that as he watched the explosion, a line from Hindu scripture came to mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test was a success. America now possessed the most powerful weapon ever created. The question was, would they use it? While scientists were building the bomb, the war against Japan raged across the Pacific. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American forces had been fighting a brutal island-hopping campaign, moving steadily closer to Japan's home islands. The battles were horrific. At Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, both sides fought with desperate ferocity. Japanese soldiers followed the code of Bushido, preferring death to surrender. kamikaze pilots deliberately crashed their planes into American ships. On Okinawa alone, the battle claimed over 100,000 Japanese lives and more than 12,000 American lives. By the summer of 1945, Germany had surrendered, but Japan fought on. The Japanese military leadership refused to accept unconditional surrender, even as American bombers were reducing Japanese cities to rubble through conventional firebombing raids. Military planners began preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself. Their estimates were sobering. Such an invasion could result in 500,000 to over 1 million American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese military and civilian deaths. President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, faced an agonizing decision. The atomic bomb offered a possible alternative, a way to force Japan's surrender without a full-scale invasion, but it would mean unleashing unprecedented destruction on civilian populations. The debate within the American government was intense. Some advisors argued that a demonstration of the bomb's power on an uninhabited area might convince Japan to surrender. Others insisted that only using the weapon on a real target would have the necessary psychological impact. Secretary of War Henry Stimson established a target committee to select potential cities. They chose locations that were militarily significant, had not been heavily damaged by previous bombing raids, and would clearly demonstrate the bomb's destructive power. Hiroshima was selected as the primary target. It was a city of approximately 350,000 people and served as an important military headquarters and communication center. It also housed significant war industries and was a key port for shipping military supplies. On July 26, 1945, the Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction if they refused. The Japanese government rejected the ultimatum. The order was given. The mission would proceed. On the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands, crews prepared for the historic mission. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was a uranium-based weapon weighing nearly 10,000 pounds. It was loaded into the bomb bay of a B-29 Superfortress bomber called the Enola Gay, named after the pilot's mother. Colonel Paul Tibbets commanded the aircraft. He was a veteran bomber pilot, carefully chosen for this unprecedented mission. His crew had trained for months, practicing high-altitude bombing runs and the sharp turn they would need to make after releasing the weapon to escape the blast. In the early morning hours of August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay took off from Tinian, accompanied by 2 observation aircraft. The 6-hour flight to Japan was uneventful. Weather planes flying ahead reported clear skies over Hiroshima. As they approached the target, the city was just beginning its day. Children were heading to school. Workers were starting their shifts at factories. People were having breakfast, running errands, living their lives. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier when weather planes appeared, but the all-clear had been given. Most people had returned to their normal activities. They had no idea what was coming. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, the Enola Gay released Little Boy from 31,000 feet. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before the detonation sequence activated. At approximately 1,900 feet above the city, the bomb exploded. In that instant, the center of Hiroshima simply ceased to exist. The nuclear explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, 15 kilotons in military terms. The temperature at the hypocenter reached several million degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. People within half a mile of the blast were vaporized instantly. Their bodies simply disappeared, leaving only shadows burned into stone walls and pavement, dark silhouettes where people had stood between the light and the surface behind them. Those slightly farther away were killed by the intense heat and radiation. The thermal pulse ignited clothing, skin, and buildings. People's bodies were burned black. Many who survived the initial blast later described victims walking like ghosts, skin hanging from their bodies, arms outstretched, in shock. The blast wave followed milliseconds later, traveling at over 750 miles per hour. Buildings collapsed as if made of paper. Thousands of people were crushed beneath debris or impaled by flying glass and wood. Cars were tossed like toys. Trees were uprooted and set ablaze. A massive fireball formed, sucking oxygen from the surrounding area and creating hurricane-force winds. These winds started countless fires across the city. Within minutes, a firestorm was raging, with temperatures hot enough to boil the water in rivers and canals. The mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet into the sky, visible for miles around. Aboard the Enola, the crew felt the shockwave, even though they had flown several miles from the blast site. Looking back, they saw the city disappearing beneath smoke and fire. Narrator: approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly or within hours of the bombing. Tens of thousands more were injured. Many would die in the following days and weeks from burns, injuries, and a mysterious new affliction, radiation sickness. On the ground, the scene was apocalyptic. Survivors wandered through the ruins, dazed and burned. Many were blinded by the flash. Mothers searched frantically for children. Emergency services were overwhelmed or destroyed. Hospitals were obliterated, and most doctors and nurses had been killed. The fires burned for days. Bodies lay everywhere, in streets, in rivers where people had sought water, buried in collapsed buildings. The smell was overwhelming. One survivor, a child at the time, later recalled, "The whole city had become a vast cemetery. We walked through streets lined with corpses. The living envied the dead." In the hours and days after Hiroshima, the Japanese government was in chaos. Communications with the city had been cut off. When reports finally came through describing the unprecedented destruction, many officials didn't believe them. Some in the military argued that the United States couldn't possibly have more than one such bomb. They were wrong. On August 9, 1945, just 3 days after Hiroshima, another B-29 bomber named Boxcar took off from Tinian. This time, the weapon was Fat Man, a plutonium-based bomb even more powerful than Little Boy. The primary target was the city of Kokura, but when the bomber arrived, thick clouds obscured the city. After 3 passes without being able to see their target clearly and running low on fuel, the crew diverted to their secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was a major port city with a population of approximately 240,000. It was home to shipyards and the Mitsubishi Armaments Factory. Unlike Hiroshima's relatively flat terrain, Nagasaki's hilly geography would ultimately limit the bomb's destructive radius. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated over the Urakami Valley, about 2 miles north of the intended aiming point. The explosion yielded 21 kilotons, more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, but the hills contained some of the blast. Still, the devastation was catastrophic. An estimated 40,000 people died immediately, with the death toll rising to approximately 70,000 by the end of 1945. The Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in East Asia, was destroyed. The Mitsubishi factories were obliterated. Many victims were Koreans who had been forced to work in the factories as laborers. Their suffering would remain largely unacknowledged for decades. Even after Nagasaki, some Japanese military leaders wanted to continue fighting. But Emperor Hirohito, breaking with tradition, intervened directly. On August 15, 1945, his voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time in history. In his surrender announcement, the emperor stated, "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization." World War II was over. The most destructive conflict in human history had ended with the most destructive weapons in human history. The cost was staggering. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, over 200,000 people had died by the end of 1945. In the years that followed, tens of thousands more would die from radiation-related illnesses, particularly cancers and leukemia. The survivors of the atomic bombings are known in Japanese as Hibakusha, literally, explosion-affected people. Their testimonies provide haunting glimpses into the human reality behind the statistics. Many Hibakusha suffered not only physical injuries, but also social stigma. There were fears that radiation exposure was contagious or would affect future generations. Some survivors had difficulty finding employment or marriage partners because of discrimination. Children born to Hibakusha were sometimes called atomic bomb children and faced prejudice. Medical studies would later show increased rates of certain cancers and other health problems among survivors and their children, though the genetic effects remained complex and debated. The physical scars were visible: keloid burn scars, disfigurement, disabilities. The psychological scars ran even deeper. Many survivors suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Flashbacks, nightmares, and survivors' guilt haunted them for decades. Yet many Hibakusha became powerful advocates for peace. Despite their suffering, they dedicated their lives to ensuring that nuclear weapons would never be used again. Their testimony became a crucial part of the anti-nuclear movement worldwide. One survivor, Setsuko Thurlow, who was 13 years old in Hiroshima, later said, "I am alive today by sheer luck. Most of my classmates died. I have dedicated my life to making sure no one else experiences what we did." For nearly 80 years, historians and ethicists have debated whether the atomic bombings were necessary or justified. The arguments on both sides are serious and deeply felt. Supporters of the decision argue that the bombings saved lives by ending the war quickly. They point to the projected casualties of a land invasion, potentially millions dead on both sides. They note that Japan showed no signs of surrendering and that the country's military was preparing civilians to fight to the death with bamboo spears if necessary. They argue that the shock of the atomic bombs was necessary to overcome the Japanese military's refusal to accept defeat. Critics counter that Japan was already defeated and on the verge of surrender. They argue that the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on August 8th, between the two bombings, would have forced surrender regardless. They point out that the targeting of civilian populations violated the principles of just war theory. They question whether the second bombing was necessary at all, given that Japan had not been given enough time to respond after Hiroshima. Some historians suggest that the bombs were dropped partly as a demonstration to the Soviet Union, a first shot in the Cold War rather than a final blow in World War II. Others note that racism and dehumanization of the Japanese people may have made the decision easier for American leaders. The debate will likely never be fully resolved. What is clear is that the decision to use atomic weapons remains one of the most consequential and controversial choices in modern history. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki opened the door to a new and terrifying age. Within years, the Soviet Union developed its own atomic weapons. An arms race began that would dominate international relations for decades. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union built arsenals containing tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, many far more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The world lived under the shadow of potential nuclear annihilation, a concept known as mutually assured destruction. Today, 9 nations possess nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. Despite arms control efforts, approximately 13,000 nuclear warheads still exist worldwide. Modern nuclear weapons are incomparably more powerful than Little Boy and Fat Man. A single contemporary thermonuclear warhead can have an explosive yield measured in megatons, millions of tons of TNT, hundreds of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The threat of nuclear war, whether through deliberate attack, accident, or miscalculation, remains one of the greatest dangers facing humanity. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the scars of August 1945 are still visible. The cities have been rebuilt and are thriving again, but monuments and museums ensure that the tragedy is never forgotten. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial, known as the Atomic Bomb Dome, stands as it was left after the bombing, a skeletal reminder frozen in time. It was one of the few structures to remain standing near the hypocenter. In 1996, UNESCO designated it a World Heritage Site. Every year on August 6th and August 9th, memorial ceremonies are held in both cities. At 8:15 a.m. in Hiroshima and 11:02 a.m. in Nagasaki, bells ring and people observe moments of silence. Thousands of paper cranes, a Japanese symbol of peace and hope, are folded and displayed, inspired by the story of Sadako Sasaki, a girl who died of leukemia caused by the bombing. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum tell the story of the bombings through artifacts, photographs, and survivor testimonies. They are sobering places, forcing visitors to confront the human cost of nuclear weapons. The mayors of both cities have become global advocates for nuclear disarmament. Every year, since 1982, the mayor of Hiroshima has sent letters of protest to any nation conducting nuclear weapons tests. In 2017, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons won the Nobel Peace Prize. In their acceptance speech, Hibakusha Setsuko Thurlow said, "Let us all work together to make our world more peaceful and safe for our children and grandchildren, and all future generations. That is our moral obligation." The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked both an ending and a beginning. They ended the deadliest war in human history, but they began an age in which humanity possessed the power to destroy itself entirely. The images from those August days in 1945 The mushroom clouds, the burned shadows, the ruins of cities remain seared into our collective memory. They serve as a warning of what we are capable of when science and war converge without restraint. More than 200,000 people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not as soldiers in battle, but as human beings going about their daily lives. They were teachers and students, factory workers and shopkeepers, parents and children, with hopes and dreams and loved ones. Their deaths ask us difficult questions that we still struggle to answer. When, if ever, can such destruction be justified? How do we balance military necessity against moral law? What responsibilities do we bear for the weapons we create? As we move further from 1945, fewer and fewer Hibakusha remain to tell their stories firsthand. Their message, however, endures. Remember what happened. Remember what nuclear weapons can do. And work to ensure that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the first and last use of atomic weapons in war. The fate they survived must never become humanity's fate. That is their legacy. That is their hope. And that is our responsibility. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe for more content like this every week and hit the bell so you don't miss an upload.